A woman sits before an oracle and asks the same question for the 7th time. The room is silent except for the candle beside her and the soft scrape of one card being placed on the table. The answer is clear. It was clear the first time, but it is not the answer she wanted. So she asks again, changing the words, softening the request, pretending she is seeking clarity when she is really seeking permission to disobey what she already knows. The oracle does not become louder. It simply stops answering. There comes a point where asking for another sign is no longer spiritual openness. It is refusal disguised as devotion. There is a belief that is spread through spiritual communities like ink through water, coloring everything it touches. The belief is this, that asking for more signs is a mark of wisdom, that the careful person, the spiritually responsible person, the humble person, asks and asks and asks again until the answer is unmistakable, unavoidable, and impossible to deny. You have been taught that more confirmation is always better. You've been told that waiting for another sign is the same as discernment. But this belief, however widely shared, is not always wisdom. It is sometimes its opposite. It is sometimes the most elaborate form of avoidance a conscious person can construct, because it borrows the language of spirituality to justify the refusal of what was already known. The truth that this archive holds is quieter and more confrontational than the version you were given. Guidance does not repeat itself indefinitely. It does not grow louder simply because you preferred not to hear it the first time. It does not keep sending the same message in different packaging until you find a version soft enough to accept. There are frequencies within reality that transmit once, cleanly, and then wait. Most people are not waiting for clarity. They are waiting for a sign that agrees with them. This is the distinction that changes everything. Because when you understand it, you realize that the spiritual hunger driving you to seek one more oracle, one more reading, one more dream, one more repeating number, is not always a search for truth. It is often a negotiation with truth. It is a desire to find a version of guidance that does not ask you to do the uncomfortable thing, leave the familiar place, or release the person you are not yet ready to release. The false belief says that more asking equals more faith. The deeper law says something else entirely. It says that when the first answer arrives cleanly and you cannot accept it, the problem is not insufficient information. The problem is insufficient courage. And no amount of additional signs will manufacture courage that you have not yet chosen to find inside yourself. Consider how many times in your own life you received an immediate knowing, a quiet internal event that happened the moment you asked, not a dramatic lightning bolt, not a shaking in the earth, just a stillness, a sudden orientation, a sense of direction that arrived before you had time to bargain with it. And then consider how quickly you dismissed it, how quickly you decided it was too simple, too fast, too inconvenient, or not dramatic enough to be real. That first transmission was the answer. Everything that followed, every additional sign you sought, every second and third and seventh reading, was not a search for guidance. It was a campaign to overrule what guidance had already said. The belief that more confirmation is always appropriate ignores one critical mechanism. It ignores the reality that the subconscious mind, when it is afraid, does not shut down its seeking behavior. It escalates it. It sends you to more readers, more methods, more systems, more interpretations, precisely because it cannot tolerate what the first system already showed. The seeking is not neutral. It is driven, and what is driving it is not curiosity. It is fear wearing the costume of spiritual diligence. This archive does not judge the fear. Fear is a legitimate signal in its own right, but fear must be recognized for what it is. When you mistake fear for spiritual discernment, you enter a loop where no answer is ever sufficient. You enter a loop where the goal is not to receive truth, but to delay acting on it. And loops of that kind do not open outward. They tighten. There is another layer to this false belief that must be addressed with care. Many people believe that because they are spiritually open, because they believe in signs and synchronicity and the language of the universe, they are therefore immune to self-deception in this area. They believe their seeking is pure. They believe their asking is honest. But spiritual openness does not automatically protect you from the ego's capacity to use spiritual tools in service of its own comfort. The ego is extraordinarily resourceful, and it has learned in spiritual communities that it can frame avoidance as devotion. You are not open simply because you believe in signs. You are open when you are willing to receive a sign that disrupts your preferences. That is the threshold, and most people have not yet crossed it. They are open to confirmation, not to truth. And the moment they understand the difference, the entire landscape of their seeking changes. What this codex will give you is not another list of signs to watch for. It is not a method for attracting more signals from the universe. It is something rarer, something that most spiritual teachings do not offer because it demands more than comfort. This audiobook will teach you to recognize when you already have the answer. It will teach you to identify the first transmission, the original quiet signal that arrived before your fear had time to interfere, and to understand why that signal carries a weight that no later confirmation can equal. You will learn the law beneath the event. You will understand why guidance often arrives first, and most clearly, why the initial impression, the sudden knowing, the first interpretation of a sign, tends to be the most accurate before the mind begins its work of renegotiation. This is not a poetic idea. It is a mechanism, and when you understand how it operates, you will never look at your own sign-seeking behavior in the same way again. From there, this codex will show you why most people misread or simply ignore the first answer. Not because they are spiritually blind, not because they are broken, but because the systems of attachment, the emotional stakes, the fear of loss, and the desire for certainty without vulnerability have taught them to distrust exactly the kind of quiet, immediate, inconvenient knowing that genuine guidance tends to produce. You will recognize yourself in this section. That recognition is not meant to shame you. It is meant to locate you, to show you precisely where in the loop you have been standing. You will then walk through a series of examples drawn from the most emotionally charged territories of life. Relationships where the first feeling was dismissed as fear. Jobs where the body said no before the mind had time to construct a reason. Moves, friendships, creative decisions, and health choices where the original signal was present, was felt, was noticed, and was then buried under an avalanche of second opinions and contradictory readings. These examples are not here to perform recognition for its own sake. They are here to install a new perceptual pattern inside you so that the next time a first answer arrives, something in you will already know how to receive it. Then comes the mirror. You will be shown how this pattern looks from the outside. The repeated asking, the shifting of the question, the emotional bargaining, the sudden suspicion that reality has stopped speaking. You will see how the pattern operates not as a spiritual practice, but as a form of self-protection that eventually turns against the person it was designed to serve. And you will be shown what the pattern reveals underneath, about identity, about the belief that you cannot trust your own reading of reality, about the deep suspicion that you are not safe in the presence of your own knowing. After the mirror comes the protocol. The silent oracle. Protocol is not a system of superstition. It is not a ritual designed to give power to external objects or random events. It is a precise, internally grounded method for identifying the original answer, naming the emotion that resisted it, requesting one clean confirmation if that is genuinely needed, and then moving forward with the kind of modest, grounded action that builds trust between you and the deeper intelligence that communicates through your life. This protocol was designed to replace the loop with a sequence. To replace endless asking with a single clear movement. You will also learn what corrupts the method, the mistakes that turn spiritual discernment into spiritual consumerism, the behaviors that masquerade as carefulness but are actually the refusal to be accountable to what you already know. These warnings are not punishments, they are calibrations. They exist so that the protocol stays clean and the method stays honest. And finally, this codex will apply all of that to the decisions that carry the heaviest emotional weight. Relationships that feel impossible to leave or impossible to pursue. Money decisions that sit at the intersection of fear and desire. Creative paths that feel too uncertain to commit to without one more sign. Career thresholds where the stakes feel too high for a quiet internal knowing to be sufficient. In these territories, the teaching deepens, because this is where spiritual maturity is actually tested. You will leave this archive different from how you arrived, not because you were given a new belief to hold, but because something in the architecture of your perception will have shifted. You will understand what the first answer is, why it matters, and why honoring it is not reckless, but is in fact the most sophisticated form of spiritual literacy available to you. This archive was not assembled for the casually curious. It was assembled for those who sense that they have been circling the same answer for too long and are finally ready to stop. If the language of the third library feels like a system you have always sensed existed but could never find, then remain in this library. There are other codices here, other transmissions waiting in the silence. Subscribe to the third library and the archive will remain open to you. Before any sign can be understood, before any protocol can be applied, before any method can work, there is a law that must be named. It is called here the law of first transmission. And it states this, that the most accurate signal from the deeper intelligence of reality tends to arrive first, before the mind has organized its resistance, before the emotions have calculated the cost, and before the identity has measured the disruption against its own comfort. This law is not arbitrary. It is structural. The first transmission arrives in the space before interpretation. Before you know what it means for your plans, for your relationships, for your self-image, for your safety. And because it arrives before all of that interference, it carries a purity that later signals almost never possess. Later signals have already been filtered. They have already been shaped by what you fear, what you want, and what you believe you deserve. Think of the first transmission as a message sent directly to the instrument before the instrument has tuned itself to a particular station. The moment you begin to want a specific answer, you have tuned the instrument. You have changed what it can receive. You have introduced a bias into the receiving mechanism that will now color everything that comes through. But the first transmission arrived before you tuned anything. That is why it carries a different quality. This is not a spiritual fantasy. It is an observable pattern that appears consistently when people look honestly at the timeline of their own major decisions. Ask yourself, in the moments before you knew what the outcome would cost you, what did you feel? Not what did you think? Not what did you hope? What did you feel in the first instant before the mind arrived to explain it away? The law of first transmission operates across every domain of life. In relationships, it is the first impression that was too inconvenient to take seriously. In career decisions, it is the immediate internal orientation that said no before the offer was even fully explained. In health situations, it is the quiet understanding that arrived before the research began. In creative work, it is the first direction that the project wanted to go before the maker second-guessed it into something smaller. The first transmission appears in all of these places, and in almost all of these cases, it is the one signal that was most likely to be dismissed. Why is the first answer often inconvenient? Because genuine guidance does not sort its messages by what you are ready to hear. It sorts them by what is true, and the truth, when it arrives before your filters are in place, often reveals exactly the thing your ego was hoping the oracle would give it permission to avoid. There is another element to the law of first transmission that must be understood. It is not always loud. In fact, it almost never is. The loudest signals you receive are often the ones that have been amplified by your own anxiety, by your own longing, by your own pattern of attention. The genuine first transmission tends to arrive with a quality of quietness, a single clear note in a room that is not yet filled with noise. This is one reason people miss it. They are calibrated for drama. They have been conditioned through spiritual content and popular interpretations of synchronicity to expect the sign to arrive with force, to arrive in a way that is unmistakable and undeniable. But the silent oracle rarely performs, it transmits. And transmission does not require an audience. The law of first transmission has a second dimension that is equally important. The first answer is not only the most accurate, it is also the most honest about what the answer will require from you. When the first impression says leave, it has already accounted for the difficulty of leaving. When the first impression says stay, it has already weighed the cost of staying. It is not naive, it is not optimistic. It is oriented. It carries within it the full shape of what honoring it will demand. This is precisely why it is so often refused. Because when you receive the first transmission, some part of you already knows what will be asked, and the asking is rarely comfortable. The first answer to the question about the relationship often arrives with the knowledge that honoring it will mean solitude. The first answer about the job often arrives with the understanding that honoring it will mean financial uncertainty for a period. The first answer about the creative direction often arrives with the awareness that honoring it will mean starting over. The first answer is complete. It is not just a direction. It is a direction plus its full consequences, held in a single quiet moment of knowing. Most spiritual traditions that have survived long enough to carry real wisdom have encoded this law in one form or another. The Zen teacher who says that the first response is the pure response. The contemplative who distinguishes between the initial movement of the soul and the subsequent reasoning of the ego. The indigenous knowledge keeper who distinguishes between the first listening and the second listening, noting that the second listening has already been contaminated by self-interest. These are not identical traditions, but they are pointing at the same mechanism. The mechanism can be described this way. There is an intelligence that moves through your life and communicates through contrast, through resonance, through timing, through the behavior of your nervous system in response to specific possibilities. This intelligence does not have a waiting room. It does not schedule appointments. It transmits in real time, in the space of perception itself, and its first transmission is its clearest, because it arrives before your preference system has time to root it through its own editorial process. Once your preference system gets involved, the signal is no longer clean. It has been interpreted, it has been sorted, it has been measured against what you want. And what your preference system wants, what your ego wants, is not always what the deeper intelligence is pointing toward. In fact, in the areas of life where you are most attached, most afraid, and most desperate for a particular outcome, your preference system is almost guaranteed to distort the signal, not because you are flawed, but because attachment is a noise-generating mechanism. It fills the frequency with static. There is also a timing element to the law of first transmission that deserves careful attention. The first answer does not only arrive before your filters activate, it also tends to arrive at a specific moment in the unfolding of an event. It arrives at the threshold, at the moment when the possibility first becomes real to you, not when you have been deliberating for weeks, not when the decision has already been made and you are seeking retroactive confirmation, but at the exact moment when the question became genuinely open. If you have missed that moment, if you did not receive the first transmission at the threshold, it is not because guidance failed to send it. It is more likely that you were not present. You were already deliberating. You were already inside the machinery of wanting a particular outcome. And the signal, quiet as it is, cannot compete with the volume of that machinery. This is why one of the most important practices available to you is not a practice of seeking more signs. It is a practice of returning to the threshold moment, of going back in memory to the earliest instant when you became aware of the possibility in question, and asking yourself honestly what was present in that moment before you began to reason about it, before you began to want, before you began to calculate. What was the first impression? What was the first movement inside you? What arrived before the noise? The law of first transmission also carries within it a quiet warning, and the warning is this: the further you move from the moment of first transmission, the more work is required to recover the original signal. Every day you spend seeking additional confirmation adds another layer of interference. Every additional reading, every additional interpretation, every time you ask the same question of a different system, you are not getting closer to clarity. You are getting further from it. Because clarity was highest at the beginning, this does not mean that reflection is wrong. Reflection is not the same as escalation. There's a difference between sitting quietly with the original answer and moving outward from it in search of a different one. Reflection moves inward and deepens the understanding of what was already received. Escalation moves outward and dilutes what was received into something more manageable. One of these is discernment, the other is avoidance. The law of first transmission also explains a pattern that many people report but cannot fully understand. They describe a feeling of having known all along. They say, looking back, that they always knew this was going to happen, that they always knew the relationship would not survive, that they always knew the job was wrong, that they always knew the path would eventually lead here. And they are almost always correct. They did know. The first transmission arrived, they received it, and then they spent weeks or months or years of their lives seeking permission to disobey it. That phrase deserves to be held for a moment. Seeking permission to disobey. Because that is what most extended sign-seeking is when the first answer has already arrived. It is a campaign dressed in the language of discernment to find a system or a signal or an oracle that will say the opposite of what the first transmission said, so that you can act on your preference without having to own the choice as a preference. This is not a small distortion. It shapes entire lifetimes. It delays decisions by months and years. It exhausts people spiritually, emotionally, and physically. It builds resentment toward signs because the signs keep saying the same thing, and the person keeps needing them to say something else. And eventually, as described in the opening of this archive, the oracle goes quiet. Not because guidance has abandoned you, but because the loop of asking has become impenetrable to transmission. The law of first transmission is not a punishment for those who ignored it. It is not a one-time event that closes a door forever, but it is a law. And laws have consequences. The consequence of repeatedly refusing the first transmission is not spiritual death, it is spiritual noise. It is the accumulation of unanswered loops that make the frequency of your life increasingly difficult to read, until sitting before the oracle begins to feel like sitting before a wall. Understanding this law is the first movement in what this archive offers you. Because once you understand it, you stop trying to add more signals to a situation and you start trying to locate the original one. You stop moving outward into more asking and you start moving inward toward what was already known. That shift in direction is not small. It is the beginning of a completely different relationship with the way reality speaks. If the first transmission is genuinely the clearest signal, then why do so many people consistently fail to receive it or fail to honor it when they do? This is not a question with a simple answer, because the mechanisms that corrupt the reception of the first answer are layered, and they are deeply embedded in how most people have been trained to navigate uncertainty. But they can be named. And naming them is the beginning of dissolving their power over you. The first and most foundational reason is emotional attachment. When you need a particular outcome to be true, your receiving system is no longer neutral. It has already been oriented toward a specific frequency, and it will naturally interpret incoming signals through that orientation. This is not a moral failure. It is the way the mind works when the stakes feel high. But it means that in the areas of life where you are most attached, you are also most likely to misread or dismiss the first transmission, because the first transmission may not be aligned with what your attachment is demanding. Consider the person who is deeply in love with someone who is not suited for them. The first impression, that quiet initial knowing, often arrives with full clarity. Something about this is not right. Something here requires more from you than you have to give, or takes more from you than is healthy to lose. The first transmission is not romantic, it is not excited, it is oriented. But the attachment, the longing, the fear of being alone, and the genuine warmth that exists alongside the incompatibility together create enough noise to drown out that quiet first signal. And so, the person seeks more signs, and the signs keep arriving, and the seeking continues, and the original knowing is buried deeper with each consultation. The second mechanism is the fear of loss. Fear of loss is not identical to attachment, though they operate together. Fear of loss is specifically the terror of what honoring the first answer will remove from your life. When the first transmission points toward an ending, a release, a departure, or a surrender, The fear of loss activates immediately and powerfully. And it does not feel like fear of loss. It feels like carefulness. It feels like wisdom. It feels like not wanting to make a mistake. But what it is actually doing is making the cost of honoring the first answer feel so catastrophic that seeking an alternative answer becomes the only bearable option. This is one of the most important distortions to understand, because it is dressed so convincingly in the clothing of responsibility. You tell yourself you are being careful. You tell yourself you do not want to act rashly. You tell yourself that a decision this important deserves more time, more confirmation, more certainty. And all of that may be technically true. But underneath those reasonable statements, if you look honestly, you will often find a terror so specific and so sharp that it could not be called anything other than what it is: the refusal to lose what you already have. The third mechanism is the desire for control. Genuine guidance, the kind that arrives as a first transmission, does not offer you control over how the answer unfolds. It offers you a direction. And direction without control is uncomfortable for most people, because control is what makes uncertainty feel survivable. When you ask for a sign, what you are often asking for is not merely a direction. You are asking for reassurance that if you follow the direction, the outcome will be safe, that nothing terrible will happen, that you will not be hurt, that the path will cooperate with your preferences once you have committed to it. But guidance does not make that promise. And so the first answer, which arrives as a direction without guarantees, is rejected in favor of continuing to ask, because somewhere in the asking is the hope that the next answer will come packaged with certainty. The fourth mechanism is what might be called spiritual consumerism. This is a pattern that has grown significantly within communities where signs, readings, synchronicity, and metaphysical tools are widely available and widely discussed. Spiritual consumerism is the habit of seeking spiritual input not as a sincere practice of discernment, but as a form of emotional management. People in this pattern do not go to an oracle to receive truth. They go to feel better. They go to feel heard. They go to reduce the anxiety of uncertainty, at least temporarily. And when the oracle says something that increases anxiety rather than reducing it, they return to a different oracle. And when that oracle says something similar, they go to another one. Not because they disbelieve the answers, but because the act of seeking has become the management mechanism itself. The seeking is the destination, because arriving at an answer would mean having to act. The fifth mechanism is the distrust of internal knowing. Many people have a deep foundational belief that they cannot be trusted to read their own signals accurately. This belief is often the result of past experiences where they were wrong, where they acted on an internal knowing and it did not produce the outcome they expected, or where they were told by others that their instincts were unreliable, dramatic, or irrational. This kind of accumulated mistrust does not stay contained to the situations where it was formed. It spreads. It begins to color all internal knowing as suspect. And so when the first transmission arrives, even if it is clear and quiet and accurate, the person immediately seeks external confirmation. Not because the first transmission was unclear, but because internal knowing itself has been deemed untrustworthy. The sixth mechanism is the confusion between speed and recklessness. There is a cultural assumption present in both secular and spiritual contexts that the more time you take to decide something, the more serious you are about it. That deliberation is always a sign of maturity. that the person who acts quickly has not thought carefully enough. This assumption, when applied to spiritual signals, creates a bias against the first answer simply because it arrived quickly, because it arrived before you had time to struggle with it. And the bias says that a real answer, a reliable answer, a responsible answer must be earned through effort and time. But the first transmission does not arrive slowly because it is careless. It arrives quickly because it is not generated by the analytical mind. It is transmitted from a level of intelligence that operates faster than reasoning. And penalizing it for its speed is like dismissing a compass because it points north before you've had time to debate the matter. The seventh mechanism is the belief that more information always produces better decisions. This belief is deeply embedded in modern thinking, and it is not entirely wrong. In many domains, more information does produce better outcomes. But in the domain of spiritual and intuitive discernment, there is a threshold beyond which additional information begins to degrade the quality of the decision rather than improve it. This threshold is crossed when the additional information is not being added to an honest evaluation, but is being added in the hope of finding a piece of information that overrules the first answer. When that is what is happening, more information is not adding to your clarity. It is adding to your confusion, because none of it can settle the question that the first transmission already answered. The eighth mechanism is the phenomenon of second-guessing the oracle once you have acted on it. Many people do not only seek endless signs before a decision, they continue seeking after the decision has been made, looking for confirmation that they chose correctly. And when the path becomes difficult, when obstacles appear, when things do not unfold smoothly, they interpret that difficulty as evidence that they misread the original signal and begin the cycle of seeking all over again. This is a critical distortion, because difficulty is not evidence of wrong direction. Difficulty is a feature of almost every meaningful path. Conflating difficulty with misdirection returns you to the loop every time the journey becomes hard. The ninth mechanism is the normalization of indecision within spiritual communities. There is a way of speaking about waiting for signs that has become, in certain circles, a badge of spiritual seriousness. Waiting for the right sign, not being ready yet, still in the process of discerning. These are not inherently wrong statements. There are situations where patient waiting is exactly what is required. But when waiting becomes a permanent posture, when the discernment never resolves, when the signs keep arriving and the decision never gets made, then the language of spiritual patience is no longer describing patience, it is describing paralysis. And the community that normalizes this as virtue is inadvertently normalizing the refusal to act on what has already been received. The pattern of ignoring the first answer is not abstract. It does not live only in theory. It lives in the specific moments of specific lives, in choices that carried real weight and produced real consequences, depending on whether the first transmission was honored or buried. The examples that follow are not presented to generate guilt. They are presented as mirrors, because recognition is the beginning of change. Consider the woman who met someone and in the first conversation felt a specific quality of unease, not the healthy nervousness of new connection, not the pleasant disorientation of chemistry, something quieter and more precise, a sense that this person's energy moved toward her in a way that felt claiming rather than connecting. She noticed it. She noted it internally. And then, because he was charming and attentive, and because she had been alone for a long time, She dismissed the feeling and called it anxiety. She spent the next 2 years trying to understand why the relationship felt extracting rather than nourishing. The first transmission had told her in the opening minutes of their first exchange. She had received it and then chosen not to honor it. Consider the man who was offered a promotion at a company where he had worked for 6 years. The moment the offer was extended, something in his chest contracted, not with fear of failure, with something more like recognition, a sense of, this is not it. He could not explain it. The offer was financially significant. The title was impressive. Everything in his external circumstances said yes, and so he dismissed the contraction and accepted the offer. He spent the next 3 years managing his growing sense of spiritual suffocation until the company restructured and the position was dissolved. He was relieved. That relief told him everything the first transmission had already said on the day the offer was placed in front of him. Consider the young woman who had been living in a city for 4 years and had received, one afternoon while walking through a neighborhood in a different city she was visiting, an immediate and unmistakable sense of this is where I belong. She had never lived there. She had no plan to live there. The first transmission arrived in a single walk, in a single afternoon, clear as a direction printed on a map. She dismissed it as romanticism. She returned to her city. She continued her life there for another 3 years, each year feeling more like a friction than a residence. She eventually moved. She has not regretted it. But the first transmission arrived 3 years before she honored it. Consider the man who had a friend of 12 years and felt, after a specific conversation, a shift. Something had changed in the quality of the friendship. The exchange had revealed something about how the friend actually saw him, something about the level of care present in the relationship. The first transmission arrived in the silence after the conversation. A quiet, clear sense that this friendship had reached its natural conclusion. He ignored it. He told himself that everyone has hard conversations. He continued the friendship for 4 more years, investing in a connection that the first transmission had already shown him was complete. When the friendship finally ended, it ended with the kind of rupture that leaves damage. The first answer would have allowed an ending with grace. Consider the woman who was building a creative project, a body of work she'd been developing for 2 years. One morning, very early, before she had checked any external feedback, she received a clear internal sense that the direction she had been moving in was not the right one. Not that the work was bad, but that she was building in the wrong direction. It was specific. It had shape. She felt exactly where the work wanted to go instead. She dismissed it because she had invested 2 years in the current direction and because changing course felt like admitting failure. She continued for another year before the project collapsed under the weight of its own misalignment. She rebuilt it in the direction the first transmission had indicated. It found its audience. Consider the person who had been experiencing persistent physical sensations, a tightness in a specific area, a recurring pattern of fatigue that was different from ordinary tiredness. The first transmission was clear. Something requires your attention here. Something is asking to be investigated. They dismissed it for 7 months because they were afraid of what the investigation might reveal. They told themselves it was stress. They told themselves they would look into it when things calmed down. The first answer had already arrived. The delay was entirely the product of fear. Consider the woman who was offered an opportunity in her field that felt immediately and completely right, not because it was easy, not because it came without risk, but because the moment she heard of it, something in her became oriented toward it the way a compass orients toward north. It was unmistakable. And then the analysis began, and the self-doubt arrived, and the opinions of others who did not share her vision entered the space, and she began to seek confirmation. She consulted 3 people who each said something different. She asked her oracle. She asked again. And while she was asking, someone else accepted the opportunity. The first transmission had been accurate and immediate. The seeking had been the delay. Consider the man who had carried a spiritual practice for years and felt, during a period of significant difficulty, a sudden and complete certainty about what he needed to do next. Not a plan, not an intention, a knowing. The kind that arrives without announcement and does not argue its case. He felt it for one day with total clarity. And then the doubt began. And he began to look for external confirmation of what he had internally received. He found contradictory information. He found perspectives that undermined his knowing. He spent 6 weeks seeking and lost the original clarity entirely. He had to spend another 3 months working back toward what he had known in a single day. Consider the couple who were deciding whether to remain in their relationship or release it. Each of them had received, separately and at different times, the same first transmission. Each of them had felt, in a moment of honest quiet, what the truth of the situation was. And each of them had decided independently that the answer was too costly to honor. So they had both begun to seek more signs, each in their own way, hoping that the next sign would say something easier. The relationship continued for another 18 months in a state of mutual suspension. Both of them knew. Neither of them honored what they knew. And when the ending finally arrived, both of them described it as something they had always sensed was coming. Consider the person at the beginning of a new career path who had felt, on the very first day of their training, an immediate and quiet sense that this was not where they were meant to be. Not that the field was wrong for others, not that the choice had been made stupidly, but that it was not the right fit for them specifically. They had ignored the first transmission because they had already committed to the path, because people were counting on them, because the alternative felt formless and frightening. They completed 3 years of training. They practiced in the field for 2 more. Every year, the feeling of misalignment was present. The first transmission had arrived in 1 day. It took 7 years to honor it. Consider the woman who was about to sign a contract for a living situation that her nervous system immediately rejected. Not because of anything visible or verifiable, but because walking into the space produced a specific quality of contraction that she recognized as something her body had learned to send as a signal. She ignored it because the terms were good and the alternatives felt uncertain. She lived there for 14 months in a state of low-level but persistent unease that she could never fully explain, and that she did not connect to the original transmission until long after she had moved out. Consider the man who sat with a creative idea for 3 days before anyone else had heard of it, and felt during those 3 days a specific, sustained quality of rightness about it that he had rarely felt about anything. He did not act immediately. He waited to tell someone. And when he told someone who responded with skepticism, the knowing began to dissolve. He allowed someone else's doubt to overwrite the 3 days of sustained internal signal. The idea was right. The execution he eventually chose, shaped by other people's caution, was a diminished version of what the first transmission had pointed toward. These examples do not all end in disaster. They do not all end in permanent loss. But they share a common architecture. In every case, the first transmission arrived. In every case, it was received. And in every case, something, fear, attachment, doubt, the desire for permission, or the noise of other voices, caused the person to turn away from what had already been given and begin the search for something more acceptable. The cost of that turning away was not always catastrophic, but it was always real. And it was always, in retrospect, recognizable as exactly what the first transmission had already shown. The pattern of refusing the first answer does not announce itself as refusal. It announces itself as seeking. It presents itself as spiritual practice, as discernment, as the responsible caution of someone who does not want to make a mistake. And because it wears this costume so convincingly, it is rarely recognized as the loop it is until the loop has been running for a long time and has produced enough exhaustion to make the costume difficult to maintain. The first way the pattern appears is through repetition of the original question across multiple systems. You begin with one oracle. Then, you bring the same question to another reader, another practice, another interpretive framework. You are not seeking new information. You are seeking a different answer to the same question. And when the answers align, rather than settling into the confirmation, you experience a brief reduction in anxiety followed by a resumption of seeking. Because the alignment itself was not what you needed. What you needed was permission. And permission is not the same as confirmation. The second way the pattern appears is through a subtle but consistent modification of the question itself. You begin by asking, "Should I leave this situation?" When the answer points toward yes, you return the next day and ask, "Is this situation capable of changing?" When that answer is also not what you wanted, you ask, "Is there something I have not yet tried that could shift this?" Each iteration of the question is technically different from the last, but they are all the same question, refashioned to increase the probability of receiving the answer you prefer. The question has become a negotiation instrument rather than a sincere inquiry. The third way the pattern appears is through emotional bargaining with the signs themselves. You receive a sign that you do not like, and you immediately begin to interpret it differently. You tell yourself it must mean something else. You find an alternative reading, a more positive angle, a way of turning the symbol to face a direction that produces a more comfortable interpretation. This is not discernment. Discernment brings precision to a symbol. Emotional bargaining brings preference to it. The difference is felt internally if you are willing to be honest. When you are discerning, the interpretation feels like a rival. When you are bargaining, the interpretation feels like manufacture. The fourth way the pattern appears is through the inflation of small signs while the original large signal remains untouched. You become acutely attentive to small coincidences that seem to point in the direction you prefer, while simultaneously finding reasons to discount the original and most significant signal you received. You count the number of times you see a particular sequence of numbers. You note when a song plays at a significant moment. You collect small confirming fragments, but you do not return to the original first transmission, which was neither small nor ambiguous, because returning to it would require you to do something you are not yet ready to do. The fifth way the pattern appears is through delayed action that continues to present itself as preparation. You are getting ready to act. You are almost there. You are waiting for one more confirmation before you move. But this readiness never converts into action. Another thing arrives that requires addressing first. Another uncertainty emerges that seems to need resolution before the decision can be made. The preparation never ends because it is not actually preparation. It is the architecture of delay built from the materials of spiritual language. The sixth way the pattern appears is through resentment toward the oracle itself. After weeks or months of seeking, you begin to feel that reality has stopped speaking to you, that the signs have gone quiet, that you are no longer receiving guidance. This resentment is significant because reality did not go quiet. The oracle did not abandon you. What happened is that you have asked the same question so many times in so many ways with such a specific and pressure-filled energy that you have collapsed the space in which a genuine signal could land. The seeking itself has become the obstruction. The seventh way the pattern appears is through the accumulation of contradictory readings that create genuine confusion. You've now consulted enough systems, frameworks, and interpretations that you have collected answers pointing in multiple different directions. You tell yourself you are confused. You tell yourself the signs are unclear. But the clarity was highest at the beginning, before you added all of these layers. What you are calling confusion is actually the product of your own accumulation. You have built a wall out of signs and then complain that you cannot see through it. The eighth way the pattern appears is through the seeking of validation from people rather than oracles. When the cards, the numbers, the dreams, and the synchronicities are not saying what you want, you turn to people. You tell the story of your situation to someone who loves you and will be inclined to support your preferred direction. You frame the situation in a way that elicits the response you are hoping for. You are not asking for honest counsel. You are asking for an endorsement that feels personal and warm, which is harder to dismiss than a card or a number sequence. The ninth way the pattern appears is through exhaustion. By the time the loop has been running long enough, the person inside it becomes deeply tired, not from activity, from the weight of sustained uncertainty, from the energy that goes into maintaining the seeking without ever arriving. This exhaustion is itself a signal. It is the nervous system communicating that the current approach is not a path, it is a spiral. But because the person is inside the spiral, they often interpret the exhaustion as a reason to seek more rather than a reason to stop. They believe they are tired because they have not yet found the answer. The truth is that they are tired because they already have it and have been refusing it. The 10th way the pattern appears is through spiritual comparison. You begin to measure your situation against those of others who received a dramatic sign and acted on it and had their lives transformed beautifully. You are waiting for that quality of signal. You are waiting for something undeniable, unmistakable, and cinematic. But the first transmission that arrived for you was not cinematic. It was quiet. And because it did not match the story you had absorbed about how big signs look, you classified it as insufficient and kept waiting. The 11th way the pattern appears is through the belief that clarity must feel peaceful. You associate the right answer with a feeling of calm resolution. But sometimes the first transmission arrives not with peace, but with precision. It is sharp, clear, and completely free of the comfort you were hoping it would bring. And so you dismiss it, because it does not feel the way you believe the right answer should feel. You are waiting for peace, but the first answer was clarity. And clarity is not always peaceful. Sometimes it is simply true. The 12th way the pattern appears is through the gradual replacement of the original question with a different one. You began by asking about a specific situation, but after weeks of seeking, the question has quietly shifted. You are no longer asking about the situation. You are asking whether you deserve what you want, whether you are worthy of guidance, whether you are spiritually capable enough to receive clear signals. The original question has been abandoned, and the loop continues on a new axis that has almost nothing to do with the original inquiry. If you recognize yourself in any of these descriptions, that recognition is not an indictment. It is a map. It shows you where you have been standing. It shows you where the loop began and where it has been circling since. And a map, even one that shows difficult terrain, is always a form of guidance, because a map tells you where you are, and knowing where you are is the beginning of knowing how to move. Write the word signal in the comments if you have ever felt reality delivering the same answer while you kept finding reasons not to hear it. This library is built from the recognition of those who have already begun to read the patterns. The refusal of the first answer is never only about the specific situation in question. It is a symptom. It is a surface expression of something that runs much deeper than any single decision. And what it reveals, when examined honestly and without self-punishment, is a precise portrait of the inner architecture that is currently governing your relationship with reality. The first thing the refusal reveals is a fundamental distrust of your own perception. When you cannot accept the first answer you receive, even when it is quiet and clear and arrived before your preference system had time to interfere, what you are demonstrating is a belief that your perception of reality is unreliable, that your first impressions cannot be trusted, that the readings you receive through your body, through your nervous system, through your intuitive field are insufficient and require external validation before they can be acted upon. This distrust is not a character flaw. It is almost always the residue of specific past experiences. Moments when you were told your perceptions were wrong, moments when you acted on an internal knowing and the outcome was painful. Moments when the people around you dismissed what you knew with enough force and consistency that you began to dismiss it yourself. The distrust has a history, but it has outgrown its origins. It is now operating in situations where it was not formed and where it does not belong. The second thing it reveals is a dependency on external authority that is more significant than you may have realized. When you need a card, a number, a dream, a person, or a system to tell you what you already know, you are operating from a position that locates authority outside of yourself. And this is important to understand, not as criticism, but as diagnosis. Because the question of where you locate authority determines the quality of your relationship with every signal reality sends you. If authority is always outside, then every signal you receive internally is provisional. It is pending external confirmation, and pending external confirmation is, in practice, a way of never arriving. The third thing it reveals is the shape of your specific attachments, because you do not seek endless confirmation about things that do not matter to you. You do not spiral in seeking about decisions with no emotional stake. The loop of repeated asking always forms around the specific things you are most afraid to lose or most desperate to gain. And so the very fact that you are asking for a seventh confirmation about a particular situation reveals something precise about what you are holding too tightly. It shows you exactly where your grip is strongest and where your fear of loss is most active. This is not a comfortable revelation, but it is a useful one. Because your attachments, when seen clearly, can be worked with. They can be named. They can be brought into honest relationship with the deeper part of you that knows what is true. But when they are operating invisibly, when they are dressed as spiritual seeking, and you cannot see them for what they are, they continue to drive the loop without ever being addressed. The fourth thing it reveals is a belief that you cannot survive the inconvenient answer. Somewhere beneath the seeking is a conviction that if the first answer turns out to be true, you will not be able to bear what honoring it requires, that the loss will be too great, that the change will be too disorienting, that the solitude, the uncertainty, the starting over will be more than you can hold. This conviction is rarely conscious. It does not announce itself, but it is present in every moment of seeking that occurs after the first answer has already arrived. It is the engine of the loop. The fifth thing it reveals is a specific relationship with responsibility. When you seek endless external confirmation for a decision that has already been internally received, you are also, in a subtle but significant way, distributing responsibility for the decision outward. If you act based on what the oracle said and the outcome is painful, then the oracle was wrong. If you act based on what the card showed and it does not unfold the way you hoped, then the reading was inaccurate. The external confirmation is not only sought for clarity, it is sought for coverage. It is sought so that if the answer turns out to be wrong, the responsibility for acting on it can be shared with or transferred to the external source. Genuine spiritual maturity does not seek to distribute responsibility in this way. It seeks to locate and own it, not as a burden, but as an expression of agency. The spiritually mature person understands that they are the one reading the signal, they are the one interpreting the sign, and they are the one deciding how to act on it. External systems can inform. They cannot own the decision on your behalf, and the refusal of the first answer is often, at its core, the refusal to own a decision whose consequences feel too uncertain to accept. The sixth thing it reveals is a distorted model of how guidance works. Many people operate from an implicit belief that genuine guidance will eventually force the decision, that if you wait long enough, the signs will become undeniable, that the universe will manufacture a situation so obvious and so unavoidable that the decision will make itself. This belief is deeply disempowering because it removes you from the equation entirely. It positions you as a passive recipient who simply waits until reality becomes loud enough to override your own hesitation. But reality does not typically operate that way. Guidance tends to inform, not compel. It tends to illuminate, not eliminate. The decision still belongs to you. The action still requires your willingness. And waiting for the universe to force the issue is often waiting for something that will not arrive in the form you expect. What tends to arrive instead is not a compelling sign, but a consequence, and consequences are significantly less comfortable than first transmissions. The seventh thing it reveals is a fragmented relationship with your own body as a signal receiver. The first transmission very often arrives through the body before it arrives through any other medium. A contraction, an expansion, a settling, a rising, a specific quality of ease or resistance that the nervous system produces in response to a possibility. Most people have been trained to dismiss these body signals as purely physical or purely emotional, and therefore insufficient as guidance. They have been taught that guidance should be mental, legible, rational, explainable, and so the most direct and immediate signal they possess, the one that arrives before thought, before interpretation, and before preference, is systematically ignored in favor of systems that feel more legible, but that carry significantly more distortion. The eighth thing it reveals is the presence of a specific fear that is almost universal but rarely named. The fear of being misled by your own inner knowing. The fear that if you trust yourself and act without additional confirmation, you will discover that you were wrong, that your inner knowing was not knowing at all but was wishful thinking or fear or projection, and that the consequence of having trusted it will be irreversible. This fear is understandable, but it is also, in many cases, the thing that keeps you most consistently separated from the very capacity it is supposedly protecting. Because the inner knowing is strengthened by being used, it is a faculty. It develops through practice, and the practice of honoring your first transmission, even imperfectly, even when the outcome is not exactly what you hoped, builds the trust between you and your own deepest perception in a way that no amount of external confirmation ever can. The path to trusting your inner knowing is not through more external validation. It is through the repeated, grounded, honest act of receiving what you know and then living from it. Not everything that presents itself as a first transmission is one. This distinction is not made to undermine the teaching. It is made to protect it. Because a protocol that cannot distinguish genuine guidance from projection, anxiety, or wishful thinking is not a protocol. It is a justification engine, and this archive does not exist to help you justify your preferences. It exists to help you read reality with precision. The first distortion is anxiety mimicking clarity. Anxiety is a powerful force, and one of its most important features, the one that makes it most dangerous in this context, is its ability to produce sensations that feel urgent, definitive, and real. When anxiety is present, the signals it generates in the body and the mind can feel indistinguishable from genuine knowing. They arrive with speed. They arrive with intensity. They insist on themselves. But there is a qualitative difference between the sensation of anxious certainty and the sensation of genuine first transmission. The anxious signal contracts and demands. The genuine first transmission arrives with quietness and does not argue. It is settled, even when its content is difficult. Anxiety does not settle. It escalates. Learning to distinguish between these two qualities of sensation is one of the most important skills this archive can help you develop. The second distortion is wishful thinking presenting as an inner sign. When you deeply desire a particular outcome, your imagination can generate internal experiences that feel like receiving a sign, a sense of rightness about the desired possibility, a feeling of expansion when you think about it, a kind of inner permission that arrives when you contemplate having the thing you want. This is not automatically false. Sometimes what you genuinely want is also what is genuinely right, but sometimes the rightness feeling is produced entirely by the desire itself and has nothing to do with an accurate reading of the situation. The distinguishing question here is, does this feeling arise when I think about the outcome, or does it arise when I sit quietly without thinking about anything and allow whatever is true to surface? These are different experiences. The first is imagination generated. The second is a much more reliable signal. The third distortion is the body response produced by familiarity rather than alignment. People who have spent a long time in situations that are unhealthy for them often develop a body signal pattern in which the familiar, even the harmfully familiar, produces a sense of comfort or safety. And a new possibility, even one that is genuinely better, produces contraction because it is unfamiliar. If you have lived a long time in scarcity, abundance may feel dangerous. If you have spent years in a relationship defined by low investment, genuine care may feel suffocating. The body's response in these cases is not a guidance signal, it is a conditioning response. Learning to distinguish between a guidance contraction and a conditioning contraction requires honest self-knowledge about the patterns your nervous system was formed in. The fourth distortion is projection dressed as discernment. Projection occurs when you take an internal experience, a fear, a desire, an assumption, and attribute it to external reality as though it were something you observed rather than something you generated. In the context of signs, projection produces readings that are entirely constructed from your own internal state rather than from any genuine external signal. You are not receiving a message from the situation. You are placing your message into the situation and then receiving it back as though it came from outside you. The corrective for projection is not to stop interpreting signs. It is to ask yourself honestly, am I reading this or am I writing this? The fifth distortion is the sign that was accurate once and is now being applied universally. You may have had a genuine experience of a specific sign, a number sequence, a bird, a song, a dream image that carried real and verifiable meaning in a specific situation at a specific time. And because that experience was real, you have now elevated that symbol to a permanent status in your interpretive system. Every time you see it, you interpret it as guidance, regardless of context, regardless of your emotional state at the time, and regardless of whether the situation genuinely warrants interpretation. This is how superstition forms, not from malice, from the understandable desire to hold on to a moment when the language of reality felt real. But a symbol is not a law. Context governs meaning, and applying the same meaning to the same symbol across all contexts is not discernment. It is pattern matching without awareness. The sixth distortion is the continuation of a genuine first transmission after it has already been acted on. There is a phase in the honoring of a first transmission where the signal is clear and requires action. But once the action has been taken, once the decision has been made and the path has been committed to, the transmission is no longer awaiting your response. It has received it. At that point, continuing to seek confirmation of the decision is no longer discernment. It is reopening a question that has already been answered, and reopening answered questions keeps you in a permanent state of provisional commitment that prevents the full integration of the choice you have already made. The seventh distortion is interpreting every coincidence as a targeted signal. Synchronicity is real. The language of reality does speak through pattern, timing, and meaningful coincidence. But not every coincidence is a targeted message. Not every repeated number is guidance about your specific question. Not every unexpected encounter is a cosmic confirmation of your current seeking. Part of reading reality as a communication system is knowing that not all of it is addressed to you all of the time. Discernment requires the capacity to say, "This was simply a coincidence. This was simply an interesting pattern. Not everything is a sign." And the person who has trained themselves to read everything as a sign has not developed their discernment. They have dissolved it. The eighth distortion is the panic response, masquerading as urgent knowing. There are moments when a sudden sharp internal sense of "this is wrong" or "I must act now" arrives with such force that it feels undeniably like guidance. Sometimes it is, But sometimes this urgent quality is produced by a panic response in the nervous system, a threat detection mechanism that is activating based on pattern recognition from old fears rather than genuine present moment signal reading. Genuine urgency, when it is guidance, tends to have a quality of orientation within it. Even when it calls for swift movement, there is something grounded in it. Panic urgency does not have that quality. It is purely force without orientation. Learning to feel the difference between these two is part of what it means to develop as a signal reader. The ninth distortion is the signal you manufactured by asking for one. There is a way of seeking confirmation that is so focused, so intense, and so specific in its request that it tends to produce the very sign it was seeking. When you ask the universe to show you a white feather as confirmation of your desired path, and you then go through your day hyper-attentive to white feathers, you will find one. Not because the universe placed it there in response to your request, but because you placed your attention on it. This is not a reliable method of reading first transmissions. It is a method of reading your own attention. The sign you sought is a reflection of your seeking, not an independent transmission from the intelligence of reality. What is being offered here is not a new form of seeking. It is a replacement for the loop. It is called the Silent Oracle Protocol, and it is a sequence of specific internal movements that allow you to locate the original answer. Evaluate it honestly. Request confirmation only when that is genuinely needed, and then act with the kind of grounded decisiveness that builds trust between you and the deeper intelligence of your own life. The protocol has 6 stages. Each stage is distinct. Each stage requires your honest participation. It will not work if it is used as another seeking tool. It will only work if it is used as a discernment tool. The difference is this: a seeking tool is used to find the answer you want. A discernment tool is used to reveal the answer that is true. The first stage of the Silent Oracle Protocol is called the Return to Threshold. Before you do anything else, before you consult any oracle, any system, any person, or any sign, you return to the earliest moment you can locate in which the question first became real to you. Not the moment you began seeking, the moment you began knowing. The threshold moment. Close your eyes and move backward in time through your experience of this situation. Find the earliest moment when you were aware of the possibility, before you analyzed it, before you discussed it, before you sought anything. What was present in that moment? Do not reach for the answer. Allow it to surface. You may find that this first impression was something you already know. You may find that it was something you have been working hard to forget. Either of these is significant, because what you find at the threshold is not contaminated by all of the seeking that came afterward. It is the closest thing you have to the original transmission. Write it down if you are able, not in a journal of seeking, in a record of honest arrival, a single sentence. This is what I knew before I started asking. The second stage is called naming the resistance. Once you have located the threshold impression, the next movement is to name what arose in you in response to it. Not what you thought about it, what you felt. Not intellectually, but emotionally and physically. What was the resistance? Was it fear of loss? Was it the terror of solitude? Was it the disruption to your self-image? Was it the financial implication? Was it the grief of release? Was it the shame of having stayed as long as you did? This naming is not performed to process the emotion or heal it. It is performed to separate it from the signal. Because the resistance and the signal are two different things, and when they are tangled together, They are very difficult to read individually. The resistance is real. It is valid, but it is not the same as the signal. And once it has been named, it can be set beside the signal rather than layered on top of it. This is a critical movement in the protocol, because most people, when they receive a first transmission they do not want, immediately collapse the resistance and the signal together and call the resulting confusion a sign that they need more information. The third stage is called the honest question. After naming the resistance, you now have the original threshold impression and the resistance to it sitting beside each other in your honest awareness. And from that place, you ask a single, clean, honest question. Is there a genuine piece of information I am missing, or am I resisting what I already know? This question is not rhetorical. It is sincere, and the answer to it will determine whether you need any further confirmation at all. If there is a genuine piece of information that is legitimately missing, one that would materially change the meaning or the response to the first transmission, then confirmation is warranted. But the information must be real, specific, and relevant, not a general desire for more certainty, not the discomfort of uncertainty itself dressed as an information gap. A specific, material, articulable piece of information that, if received, would genuinely alter the meaning of the first transmission. If there is no such specific information, then you have your answer. The first transmission was the answer, and what you have been calling seeking has been resistance wearing the costume of discernment. You do not need confirmation, you need courage. The fourth stage is called the single clean request. This stage applies only when the honest question has revealed that there is a genuine and specific piece of information that is legitimately missing. In that case, you make a single clean request for confirmation, not to multiple systems, not to multiple oracles. 1. You choose the system you trust most and ask it the question once, clearly and honestly, without manipulating the framing to increase the probability of a preferred answer. And then you set a response window. The response window is the specific period of time during which you will remain open to receiving a response to your request. This window should be finite, it should be no longer than necessary, and it should be pre-committed, meaning you decide the window before you receive any response so that you cannot retroactively extend it when the response arrives and turns out to be the one you did not want. When the response arrives within the window, you receive it. You do not argue with it. You do not seek a second opinion. You do not return to the first oracle and ask again. You receive it, you sit with it, and you move to the fifth stage. If no response arrives within the window, that is also a response. Silence is not a failure of the oracle. Silence is sometimes the oracle's most precise communication. When the request goes unanswered within the window, return to the threshold impression and treat it as sufficient. The absence of additional confirmation is not a reason to delay. It is a reason to trust what was already given. The fifth stage is called the modest first action. This is the stage where the teaching becomes most difficult because it requires movement, not a perfect, complete, irreversible commitment. A modest first action. A single, real, grounded step in the direction the first transmission indicated. The modest first action is important for several reasons. First, it converts the knowing into embodied experience, which is something that no amount of seeking can produce. Second, it generates information that is more useful and more real than any additional sign could provide, because it is information produced by actual engagement with the direction rather than speculation about it. Third, it breaks the loop, because the loop is maintained by perpetual consideration without movement, and a single real step, however modest, shifts the relationship between you and the situation from one of observation to one of participation. The modest first action does not have to be dramatic. It does not have to be irreversible. It simply has to be real. If the first transmission is about a relationship, the modest first action might be a single honest conversation. If it is about a direction in your work, the modest first action might be one afternoon dedicated entirely to that direction. If it is about a living situation, the modest first action might be a single inquiry about alternatives. The size of the action is less important than its reality. It must be something that actually happens, not something you plan to do when you feel more certain. The sixth stage is called the honest record. After the modest first action, you note what happened, not in the spirit of gathering evidence for or against the transmission, in the spirit of developing your own literacy. What did the first transmission feel like? What did the resistance feel like? What was the quality of the confirmation if one was sought? What happened when you acted? What does the outcome tell you about the accuracy of the original signal? This record is not a journal of seeking. It is an archive of your own signal history. Over time, it will teach you more about how guidance arrives in your specific life, through your specific body, in your specific emotional and situational contexts, than any external oracle ever could. Because the silent oracle protocol, at its deepest level, is not a method for reading signs from outside. It is a method for developing the internal capacity to be your own first oracle. And that capacity is built through honest, grounded, repeated practice. The goal of this protocol is not certainty. Certainty is not available as a permanent condition of human experience. The goal is alignment. The goal is a relationship between your internal knowing and your external action that is honest, grounded, and coherent. A relationship in which you do not outsource what you already carry to systems that can at best reflect and at worst distort what you have already received. The silent oracle protocol is the architecture of that relationship. The most important teaching is only as powerful as its protection, and every protocol, however precisely designed, can be corrupted by the specific patterns of avoidance, control, and fantasy that the very people who need it most are most inclined to bring to it. The following are not theoretical errors. They are the exact patterns that most commonly appear when people encounter this kind of teaching and attempt to apply it without first encountering themselves honestly. The first mistake is using the protocol as a new seeking instrument. This is the most common corruption of this teaching and the most important to name. The protocol was designed to replace the loop, but the person who is most embedded in the loop will attempt to insert the protocol into the loop rather than use it to exit the loop. They will perform the stages as a new form of seeking, treating stage 3 as a justification for continued asking, because they can always find some piece of genuinely missing information if they look hard enough. The honest question in stage 3 is only useful if it is asked honestly. If you use it to manufacture reasons for continued seeking, you have not applied the protocol. You have dressed the loop in new clothing. The second mistake is consulting multiple systems for the single clean request. The fourth stage of the protocol specifies one system, one request, one time. The moment you take the same request to more than one oracle, you have re-entered the old pattern. You tell yourself you are being thorough. You tell yourself that consulting two sources is simply due diligence. But what you are actually doing is building in the possibility of a contradictory answer that will justify continued seeking. One request, one system, one response window. This specificity is not arbitrary. It is the structural protection against the loop. The third mistake is retroactively extending the response window. You set the window before you receive any response. This matters because it prevents you from shifting the boundary once the response arrives. If you set a 3-day window and a response arrives on day 2 that you do not like, you cannot then decide the window should have been 10 days. The window must be pre-committed and honored as set. If you find yourself routinely extending the window after responses arrive, you are not working with the protocol. You are working with the loop under a different name. The fourth mistake is choosing the most lenient oracle rather than the most trusted one. When stage 4 specifies the system you trust most, that means the system that is proven most accurate in your experience of your own life, not the system that is most likely to tell you what you want to hear. These are not the same thing. If you choose the oracle based on its historical tendency toward optimistic answers rather than accurate ones, you have not asked for a clean confirmation. You have asked for a soft one. And a soft confirmation is not a confirmation, it is a permission slip. The fifth mistake is performing the modest first action so modestly that it produces no real information. The fifth stage must be real. It must involve genuine engagement with the direction. A first action so minimal and so hedged that it does not actually place you in contact with the reality of the direction is not a first action. It is a simulation of a first action. The protection remains intact, nothing is genuinely at stake, and the information produced is therefore insufficient to develop your signal literacy. Real action requires some degree of real exposure, not recklessness, but contact. The sixth mistake is ignoring the body truth entirely. Throughout the protocol, the body is a primary instrument. The threshold impression often arrives first through the body. The resistance is felt in the body. The response to the modest first action is felt in the body. If you are performing the protocol entirely in your analytical mind, noting what you thought rather than what you felt, tracking arguments rather than sensations, you are missing the most direct signal channel available to you. The body does not lie in the ways the mind can lie. It is not always easy to interpret, but its signals are more immediate and less filtered than almost anything the analytical mind can produce. The seventh mistake is treating difficulty after the first action as evidence of wrong direction. This mistake is responsible for more people abandoning genuinely right paths than perhaps any other distortion. When you act on the first transmission and encounter difficulty, friction, or disappointment, the old pattern immediately offers a familiar interpretation. This is a sign that you were wrong. This is evidence that the first transmission was not accurate. This is the universe telling you to return to where you started. But this interpretation is almost never correct. Almost every meaningful direction involves difficulty. The first weeks, months, or even years on a genuinely right path can be characterized by resistance, adjustment, and the painful process of learning. Difficulty is not misdirection. Difficulty is often the exact texture of the right path during its early stages. The eighth mistake is treating the protocol as a one-time event rather than a developing practice. The silent oracle protocol is not a one-time exercise to be performed in a moment of crisis and then set aside. It is a practice that develops through repeated use across many situations and many types of decisions. The signal literacy it builds does not appear after one application. It develops over time across many honest engagements with your own first transmissions, your own resistances, your own modest actions, and your own honest records. Treat it as a single-use tool, and you will find it only partially useful. Treat it as a developing practice, and it will eventually transform the entire quality of your relationship with guidance. The 9th mistake is performing stage 2, naming the resistance, as an emotional processing session rather than a naming exercise. Stage 2 is not designed to heal the resistance. It is designed to identify it so that it can be separated from the signal. If you turn stage 2 into a lengthy exploration of your emotional history, your trauma, your patterns, and your wounds, you are no longer inside the protocol. You are inside a process that may be valuable in its own right, but that is not what this stage is designed to produce. Name the resistance, acknowledge it as real, set it beside the signal, move forward. The depth of emotional work is important, but it is not the task of this specific stage. The 10th mistake is using the honest record in stage 6 to build a case against your own knowing. Some people, when they review their signal history, do so with a forensic energy that is oriented toward finding proof that their inner knowing is unreliable. They note the times the first transmission seemed to be inaccurate and use those instances to justify future rejection of first transmissions. But the honest record is not a prosecution file. It is a calibration archive. It is meant to help you understand how guidance arrives in your specific life, not to provide ammunition for the part of you that prefers to seek rather than to know. Everything this codex has offered so far becomes exponentially more significant in the domains where the emotional stakes are highest. Because it is precisely in those domains, in decisions about love, money, creative purpose, and long-term direction, that the first transmission is most frequently ignored and the loop of seeking runs most persistently. And it is also in those domains that the cost of ignoring the first answer is most deeply felt. In relationships, the first transmission tends to arrive at specific moments that carry more information than an entire year of subsequent experience. The first meeting, the first honest conversation, the first moment of genuine conflict, the first time you needed something and the other person chose whether to show up. Each of these threshold moments carries a first transmission. Each of them tells you something about the nature of this connection that is true regardless of how much you want it to be different. And the person who has developed the capacity to receive those transmissions without immediately burying them under layers of hope and projection is not a cold person. They are a perceptive one. They are someone who respects themselves enough to let reality inform them before investing years of their emotional life in a direction that the first transmission was already indicating would not sustain. In the domain of money and financial direction, the first transmission often arrives as a body signal in response to specific opportunities, a contraction in the presence of something that looks good on paper, an expansion in the presence of something that looks risky but feels right. The person who has been trained to override body signals in favor of analytical evaluation will consistently miss these transmissions, not because analysis is wrong, but because in domains governed by fear and conditioning, the analytical mind has been shaped by those fears and will reproduce their logic rather than transcend it. The body signal, arriving before the analysis begins, carries information that the analysis is not yet capable of generating. The law of first transmission applied to financial decisions also speaks to the moment of first encounter with a specific path or opportunity. When you first became aware of a particular financial direction, what was the quality of your immediate response? Not your considered response, your immediate one. The initial orientation of your nervous system toward or away from the possibility. That first response was data, and if you have been in the habit of immediately overruling it with analysis, you have been consistently discarding the most unfiltered signal you possess in favor of a filtered one. In the domain of creative work and creative direction, the first transmission often arrives as a quality of pull. A specific, inexplicable orientation toward a particular subject, form, or approach. This pull tends to arrive before the creative person has any idea how to execute the direction. It arrives before they have credentials in the area. It arrives before they have permission from anyone, and for those reasons, it is almost universally dismissed as impractical or naive. But the first transmission in creative work is not naive. It is orienting. It is pointing at the direction in which the person's genuine contribution lies. And the person who follows it, even awkwardly, even without guarantees, tends to produce work that carries a quality of inevitability that the person who ignored it and chose a more practical direction cannot replicate. Spiritual maturity in the context of all of these domains means developing the capacity to honor the first transmission before life escalates its communication. Because reality does not only communicate through quiet first transmissions, when those are consistently ignored, the communication tends to escalate. The whisper that was not heard becomes a pattern. The pattern that was not read becomes a rupture. The rupture that was not understood becomes a collapse. And each escalation is more disorienting, more costly, and more difficult to navigate from than the transmission that arrived before it. This escalation is not punishment. It is the natural consequence of a communication system continuing to transmit into a frequency that is not receiving. The transmission gets louder because quieter transmissions were not acknowledged. Spiritual maturity means learning to receive early. It means developing enough sensitivity, enough honesty, and enough courage to honor what is transmitted quietly, so that the communication does not have to escalate to reach you. The application of the silent oracle protocol to long-term spiritual timing is perhaps its most nuanced and most important use. There are periods in a life when the first transmission is not about a specific decision, but about a specific season. A sense that this is a time for stillness, not for action, or a sense that this is a time for commitment, not for exploration. These seasonal transmissions carry the same quality of quietness and the same tendency to be overruled by the preference system. But they are among the most important signals available because they speak not to a single choice, but to the orientation of an entire period of life. When you learn to read seasonal transmissions and to honor them with the same respect, you are now learning to give to individual first transmissions. The architecture of your life begins to align in a way that individual good decisions cannot produce alone. Because individual good decisions made in the wrong season still carry the friction of misalignment, but good decisions made in alignment with the season in which they belong have a quality of effortlessness that is not the same as ease. They are not without challenge, but they move with a coherence that can be felt and that deepens over time into a sustained sense of being in right relationship with the intelligence that communicates through your life. This is what the practice ultimately builds toward. Not a life free of uncertainty. Not a life where every sign is clear and every decision is obvious, but a life in which you are in genuine communication with the intelligence of your own experience. A life in which the first transmission is received, honored, and integrated before the need for escalation arises. A life in which you are not perpetually seeking permission to be who you already know you are. Return now to the room where this codex began. The candle is still burning. The table is still present. The oracle has not moved. But something is different. You are different. Not because you have been given a formula for certainty. You have not. But because you understand now what was true from the beginning. The first answer was always the clearest. It arrived before your fear organized itself, before your attachment sharpened its arguments, before the loop began its spinning. It arrived in a single quiet moment that you have perhaps been trying to outrun ever since. The woman in that room who asked for the 7th time was not spiritually open. She was spiritually exhausted. There is a difference that is important to feel. Spiritual openness is the willingness to receive what arrives. Spiritual exhaustion is what accumulates when you receive what arrives and then spend all of your energy trying to replace it with something more comfortable. The exhaustion is not a sign of your weakness. It is the cost of carrying what you already know without yet being willing to live from it. The oracle in that room did not go silent because it was punishing her. It went silent because the question had already been answered. The silence was not abandonment. The silence was completion. And the silence that you may have encountered in your own seeking, the sense that reality has stopped speaking, that the signs have gone quiet, that guidance has withdrawn, is worth revisiting now with the understanding this codex has offered. Ask yourself honestly, is the silence a withdrawal, or is it the completion of an answer that you have not yet been willing to hear? What the silent oracle protocol ultimately asks of you is not technical competence. It asks for courage. The specific kind of courage that allows you to receive a first transmission that is inconvenient, that disrupts your preference, that asks something of you that you would not have chosen to be asked, and to honor it anyway. Not recklessly, not without care, but with the grounded, eyes-open willingness of someone who has decided to be in honest relationship with reality rather than in perpetual negotiation with it. This is what reality is communicating when it speaks through first transmissions. I trust you enough to tell you the truth early. I trust you enough to say the difficult thing quietly rather than waiting until it becomes unavoidable. The question is whether you trust yourself enough to receive it. Whether you trust yourself enough to stop seeking permission for what you already know and to act from the knowing itself. The oracle is not silent because it has nothing to say. It is waiting. It is waiting for the moment when you stop asking it to say something different and begin to let what it has already said move through you into the life you are actually living. It is waiting for you to receive the first answer as sacred rather than inconvenient. That moment is not in the future. It is available to you now, in this pause, in this stillness, in the space this codex has opened inside you. If this transmission found you at the right moment, keep it close. Return to it when the signs become difficult to read, when the loop begins to spin again, when the oracle seems to have gone quiet. The third library remains open. There are other codices here, other mechanisms waiting to be named, other protocols waiting to be practiced. When you are ready, the next threshold will be present, the archive will be here.